Coming up, I'll be speaking with Lee Egerstrom, Economic Development Specialist at the Minnesota 2020 think tank. That's next on the St. Paul Forum. Welcome to the St. Paul Forum. I'm John Forde. With me today is Lee Egerstrom, Economic Development Specialist at the Minnesota 2020 think tank. Welcome, Lee.
Well, it's fun to be here, John.
How did you come to this town? You were a reporter for many years?
Yes, I grew up out in western Minnesota, a little town near Willmar called Kirkhoven. And then I went to St. Cloud State. I went into the Army, came back, went to work at the St. Cloud Times, and then later came down to the St. Paul Dispatch, the old afternoon paper, and worked for the Pioneer Press and Dispatch for a few years, and then spent the 70s in Washington at the Knight Ridder Washington Bureau, the parent company then of the Pioneer Press, and then back as an economics trade, international trade and agriculture writer for the Pioneer Press for about 36 years.
And you've been with Minnesota 2020 think tank how long now?
Since Minnesota 2020 started, actually, but a little over 3 years ago.
Okay. And you are an economic development specialist. What does that mean?
Well, Minnesota 2020 writes on and researches and works on 4 key areas that are key areas that never change. They're always here, and that we'll never get on top of. And one of them is education. One's transportation. Another is healthcare, and then my area of work is economic development. So explore different things that can help the economy move forward, what Minnesota public policy should do to explore what we might do better, how might we get the economy going, how might we be more helpful to entrepreneurs.
So the global economy is changing in very profound ways. There's much more connectivity. There are world trade agreements, and of course, there's technology driving things happening so fast. What does it mean to St. Paul?
Well, the simple answer is that Minnesota and St. Paul have to change, and the change is coming. We're in the midst of change, and where we're sitting is that either we're going to help direct the transition to a new 21st century economy, or we're going to have it imposed on us from all of those global external factors that you just cited. And we've for the last 20 years or so, we've watched basic manufacturing drift away from Minnesota. That's continuous. We've seen skilled manufacturing shift away, transfer away. The closing of the Whirlpool plant on the east side of St. Paul is a classic example of basic manufacturing that essentially moved out. And but now we're facing the closure of the Forde plant. We're a highly skilled workforce, and so subsequently change. Part of this, the St. Paul plant closure is technology driven. Newer plants with what they can do and stuff. So and how they can produce cars more efficiently, different things like that. So there's an awful lot of things coming to play on us, and we still, we still keep tooling along with a state economy and a national economy that's 70% driven by individual and household consumption.
Now, that's something that's very hard for a lot of people to get their head around. I don't know how 70% of the economy could be consumption, because those people have to earn money to get that 70%. I mean, how do they arrive at that number?
Well, first of all, how they arrive at the number is an awful lot of economists and different government agencies monitor what's driving the economy, and they measure, from commerce to the Labor Department to all across the board, finance. Everything gets measured in a sense so they know what the driving force is. The problem over the last couple of decades is that an awful lot of that, the fuel for this driving force was plastic, credit cards. And so it was a consumption level generated by an awful lot of private debt, as well as public and corporate institutional debt, etc. And that's just not sustainable. And long before the 2008 recession started, people were worrying, economists were worrying that this was not sustainable. We have to reach a point where we are producing something again, very vibrant, and we have to have a real growth in productivity. That's both goods as well as services. And the more sophisticated your economy is, the more and more on the service side that is. So we have to have that because we need this productivity to provide the jobs, to provide the consumptive power, if you will, for households, for individuals, for companies to, in fact, stimulate and drive this economy.
I saw, not much of a profound economic theorist, but Pat Buchanan say you got to make something. There's three categories. You got to mine it, you got to harvest it, or you got to assemble it. And those are the only three options. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. And it's people who kind of ignore that are, we're cursed by the fact this is a year divisible by 2 and 4.
Okay.
Because economic arguments somehow get bent terribly in election years. Mm-hmm. So, but in this case, Pat Buchanan was obviously throwing out comments about the realities of the economy and stuff. And I agree with that. He touched on 3 of the 4 greatest strengths of Minnesota. And he touched on the 3 natural resources, because we have mines. We have wonderful forests and forest product company as a result. And then the extremely productive farmland and an agricultural base. The 4th great resource that we've got here, however, is the human beings, the workforce. And that ties in with education stuff. And that has to be, has been, and has to be going forward, truly one of our greatest strengths.
Now, I have to tell you that for a long time I've been both fascinated by and repulsed by economics. And I'm repulsed by it because economics 101, you almost fall into a depression because the first day they say you have to accept the premise that people are 100% rational and 100% selfish. And I'll grant you that there may be 70% selfish, but there's a lot of altruistic behavior. But rationality, so much of consumptive behavior is driven by unconscious impulses and imitation and things like that. Yeah. And that rational choice theory leads to so much bad public policy.
Well, yes, it does. Of course it does. But the other thing is that people, the economists have won Nobel Prizes for proving this, that consumer behavior is not always rational. The same applies. Consumers are also voters. And so therefore, how could you expect public policy to always be rational?
Yeah.
Of course, we know in hindsight that often as not, it isn't rational. So that's a given. The greed motive is there, but I'm not the cynic that probably I was in my younger years. Okay. And just because I do see people making decisions economically. If greed was the measurement, then it wouldn't be all that rational. Mm-hmm. But they are making decisions. They are buying products because it's good for Minnesota, or they're buying it because they know the merchant who's selling it, and they want to support their neighborhood. So, there's a lot of decisions that go into it. We don't deal with that a lot in the United States, but a wonderful study in 1996 was done in Denmark, and they called and in this paper, looking at the year 2000 and beyond, where was Denmark going to be situated in the world economy? Wonderful study. But they also said that within that domestic economy, they had to recognize that there was a political consumer. Now, they use that term differently than we would. They use that as a political decision as a social decision that a consumer or a voter might make. Mm-hmm. So they use it in a broader sense than we typically do here. The political consumer that they see is that consumer who buys something specifically because they know who produced it, they know where it came from, they They know it's an industry they want to support. They're making some kind of a sociological decision as to what they're doing. And that's, I think, a big unexplored whole realm here in Minnesota, because it's there. It's there, but it's not developed.
I'd like to say I was at a dinner party last night, but it was a little more lowbrow than that. But people were, it was kind of a barbecue. And people there were talking about some of the local co-ops now literally giving a rating as to how far the food had traveled.
Yes.
That the more local, the better.
I've seen that at some college campuses, and you go in the student union, and as you know, the noontime meal, there'll be a little sign up about how many miles has your sushi traveled. You know, it's just, do you have as many, you know, airline miles, you know, credits as your food? Different things. So there's, you know, subtle and not so subtle messages making people stop and think about it. And then what they're dealing with is the carbon footprint. And that's how much are we spending on fossil fuels to move convenience foods into the United States? Now, the same would apply to other manufactured products, I would say. But food is a good one, always a good example. There are some things we will never produce in Minnesota, come climate change or not. We will, not in my lifetime will we become a big citrus producer.
Yeah.
All right. So subsequently, some foods that we like that are good for us have to travel. And that's just a given. The other aspects of it, a really efficient food chain with a good logistics system can greatly reduce the carbon footprint. So we've got wonderful companies based in Minnesota that work on that. Their profits are in the good logistics. So therefore, they do genuinely, seriously work on that. And that's wonderful. But at the same time, in this harvest season, when Minnesota apples are the tastiest, do we really need to have to be buying imported apples from Washington State or something? You know, so I mean that's where the conscious decision comes in. Now, a really good Minnesota developed apple is so tasty and good that we, you know, to access the good local product, you sometimes have to pay more, and that becomes yet another, you know, social problem. Fortunately, my household can waste a few cents to buy a really good local apple.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I want to ask you just something, a much more general economic question.
Yeah.
But I recently heard someone say that as of about 1980, supply-side economics became the official policy of the United States and just basically controlled the government. And after 30 years of that, we've had a worldwide crisis of demand.
Well,
do you see that as accurate?
Yes and no. I mean, it became popular, but again, it became popular in years divisible by 2, and then in odd number of years it kind of be lost. We'd pretty well backed out of what was in the early 80s argued as supply-side economics before the decade of the 80s were over. And but it's still there, but it also fits so well with the consumerism, the driving force in the economy. So therefore, it never really goes away and never will. But as economic policy, you know, just about everybody engaged at the end of the Bush administration and the startup of the Obama administrations, you get your economies working on trying to get healthy balances, and that's and not taking us off into wild, uncharted territory with new economic theories.
Someone recently said that you know, supply and demand they're kind of hard to get a handle on, but an easy way to think about them is supply side means public policies that favor profits. Demand side means public policies that favor wages. When John Maynard Keynes long ago said that profits and wages are coefficient, you can't hold one down and let the other go up forever because it's going to break.
It's like any other balance. You can't stack up everything over on this side of the scale and not expect it to totally throw this end off. So I mean that's you know, there are an awful lot of people who disagree with John Maynard Keynes over the years, but not on that point.
Okay. I'm talking to Lee Egerstrom, an economic policy specialist with the Minnesota 2020 think tank. Lee, we're putting the website up right now so people can tune into the MN 2020 website and learn more about the work you do. MN 2020 is really focused on practical things that can be done here in Minnesota, and you've done a lot of analysis about not only here but the rest of the world as examples. Some of the northern European countries, I believe, have policies that MN 2020 writes about and prescribes.
Well, indeed, and there's good reason for it. I mean, we have a tendency here in the United States to think we invent everything. We don't. If we did, we wouldn't be running these trade deficits that we've run. So subsequently, we come, ideas and public policy solutions and stuff move in this day and age of international, communications just as quickly as any product or service can. And so subsequently, then it's important that we take back and say, all right, what we're coming through was a global recession. It was triggered by the collapse on Wall Street in the finance and housing industry bubbles. And so we triggered it. But it spilled over on just about everyone. Then it seems prudent that people, including at the state and at city levels, like here in St. Paul, look at what communities have done, what states have done to insulate themselves from the worst ravages of the recession that we're going through. Because it's not equitably shared, the pain is not being equitably shared among the 50 states here at home, and definitely not among the different countries in the world. Well, there's some real ironies here, and where you look at the strongest economies right now, yes, China keeps growing. Those emerging, developing countries that are building their industrial base just keep kind of rolling along, so long as we keep buying imported plastic salad shooters, something like that, Anyway, but then who else is doing well? Who more like us are doing well? And the last 2 quarters, the German economic growth has been running about 3.6%. Germany is way, ahead of most of the industrialized country and a strong economy. England's got some problems, but they're much stronger than us. France has got some problems, but they're much stronger. Sweden is a top-performing country. And then a couple of weeks ago, Newsweek magazine just took a look at a whole host of measures across elements that can be measured that affect human life, the standards of living, as well as business climates, and just declared Finland the world's top country. Like the best country in the world is actually the title of their thing. So now how do they arrive at, how can you say that? Well, and what have they done? All of them have gone through what economists call economic shocks. To some extent, they have adjusted their economies to this new 21st century economy to build again on their strengths. And Germany and Finland, for using those two examples, have resources. There's no question about that. But they also have human strengths, a well-educated workforce, and creative entrepreneurs and inventors, etc. So what do they come through? Well, here's the case in Germany, if you'll recall. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. And so the 1990s and first part of the 20s were spent on a tremendous infusion of public investment in infrastructure and developing. And the reason was this. They had to bring the East German side up to some close to parity with the economy and the lifestyle of the people in Western Germany, because if they're going to be a unified country. If they didn't achieve that, well, two Germanys could have, on their own choice, split again or something. So subsequently, Germany has invested heavily into creating a new Germany, for its people, for its industries, and their exports are of highly, some of them are, big performing automobiles, but others are just heavy equipment, fine-tuned things that China's buying to stamp out more plastic salad shooters, stuff like that. So all of those kinds of things are working for them. Finland has, in some ways, And Finland's a small country. Despite the fact that Minnesota has ties with all of the Scandinavian countries, Finland is still kind of a small connection. But what Finland went through was a tremendous economic shock. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Soviet Union, the St. Petersburg area of Western Russia, was the market for about 25% of all the goods and services products that Finland was building. It carried their economy. And so all of a sudden, overnight, economic collapse of the former Soviet Union, they lost those markets. This coincided with Finland by design, reducing its social safety net programs. For different protections for labor, different protections for business stuff. And because they were getting ready to join the European Union, and they did in 1995. But they had to reduce those safety nets. So you ended up with better than a quarter, nearly 30% real unemployment in Finland. The economists around the world looked at poor Finland and said, whoo, this is what we mean when we use the term economic shock. Every Finn in the country called it what it was, a depression. And now they've built back, and on their strength, on their resources, and creating new businesses, providing venture capital for startup companies, and in their case, a lot of cooperative businesses started. And right now, they're really the envy of the world. And you got education leaders around the world looking at what they are doing with education, because this phenomenon of what they've achieved right now is not going to stop, because the pipeline is filled with even brighter, more educated people coming.
That's the idea of human capital has always fascinated me, because in 1865 you can't own people as of then. So how do you invest in human capital when people can walk away?
Well, and this is a tremendous strength for St. Paul, and I hope the city of St. Paul and its leaders realize this. But you invest in human capital, you invest in it by just just making sure that you've got public education that's second to none. And that's, and it doesn't really stop K through 12 here. I mean, that's where it really has to be achieved and stuff. But if you succeed at that level, then you have this next carry-up. Well, look at what we have here, both as part of the bigger, broader metropolitan area, but just within the city limits of St. Paul, a huge, big research branch of the University of Minnesota. We've got another national publication just recently listed St. Paul College as being one of the premier vocational and technical and community colleges in the nation. An enormous strength for resource development here. And but then you add on, look at all the private schools we've got. And then Metropolitan State is everywhere scattered around with offices and it takes its education classrooms on the road throughout the metro area. But it's based here. It's a St. Paul strength. So we have so many things that we can't neglect. The business community should be working hand in glove with all the private schools that we have here as well. Go up and down Snelling Avenue. Good grief, we have intellectual firepower on campus, in faculty, and coming out of with degree programs. It's a wonderful, and these are strengths that no community in the country totally utilizes to the full potential yet.
Now, some of the other examples that you've mentioned, Finland and Germany, have both high taxes and high labor costs.
Yeah.
And people tend to think of those as negatives, but are they really?
Well, this is, again, you can have this discussion a lot better in odd number of years.
Okay.
And as opposed to the even number of years that are always coincide with the elections. But yeah, do you really need to pay taxes for a good education system if you're going to teach somebody to stamp out in a plastic fabrication plant, these $1.95 salad shooters again, But do you get better payback to have good, well-trained people who are stamping out, super engine vehicles and high-speed trains and just airplanes and all of these things that take an awful lot of skill. Here in Minnesota, we have a great strength is our medical device industries. And if you're talking about implantable heart gadgets, you don't want recalls.
Yeah.
So there is no such thing as a cheap labor state that can produce for these kinds of countries, these kinds of companies.
Okay, Lee, we got about 3 minutes left, and over the years you've written a number of books about cooperative businesses.
Yeah.
Are they a model for the future?
They definitely are, and it irritates me a little bit because they're a strength in the countryside. They're a strength that kind of helps keep the rural Minnesota economy just going along and finding new ways to grow. We have never been as good as some of the European countries about bringing those concepts in for business entrepreneurship and letting workers have their own companies and run their own companies. This needs to be looked at carefully, and I know we're running close on time, but we have a lot of vacant factory properties. We have a lot of vacant commercial properties right now. And in Argentina and Brazil, up in the Mondragon region of Spain, workers are turning these into very successful plants. They run them themselves, and usually on contract. They make products for somebody under contract long term, and then they can determine what best. Meanwhile, you got everybody in the plant working in the Mondragon case at least on how can we do this better and more efficiently, because not only do I get a salary, but I also have a secondary stream of income, being a cooperative, from my equity stake in the company. This is a wonderful form of entrepreneurship that the countryside knows about, but we're still pretty naive about here in St. Paul and Minneapolis.
And why is that? Why doesn't that penetrate the urban areas a little more? Is there any have a theory as to that?
Oh, there is a good theory of it, but it has a lot to do with the fact that cooperatives are developing in Europe and the United States at about the same time that departments of agriculture were getting started, and the land-grant university systems was started here and abroad. So the research arm came down through agriculture. Well, guess what? There's schools of agriculture. They worked with farmers particularly well. Business schools, meanwhile, dealt with privately owned and publicly traded, stock corporations. And so very few business schools anywhere in the United States pay any attention to the cooperative business form. This is a terrible oversight. But it's just, the old Jerry Maguire line, follow the money.
Yeah.
The research dollars come down to business schools from corporate America and from, to some extent, from other government departments. Cooperative developments, and this includes credit unions, gets the research dollars that come, for the most part, that come down through the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
That's absolutely fascinating, Lee. Thank you so much. We're out of time, but it's been very, very enjoyable. I hope to have you back here sometime very soon.
All right. This has been my pleasure.
I've been talking with Lee Egerstrom, an economic development specialist at the Minnesota 2020 think tank. Thanks for joining us. We hope to see you next week on the St. Paul Forum.
So.